All right, everybody, as promised, I'm recording a video lesson for you to finish up our little unit on Andrew Jackson's presidency. So let's jump back in and get started. So yesterday we went over the first part of Jackson's bank war. What did we learn? We learned that the Whig Party, the opposition party to Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party, essentially set a trap, a political trap for Andrew Jackson. They dared President Jackson to veto the Second Bank of the United States 4 years earlier than they had to during Andrew Jackson's re-election campaign. So we kind of took a look at that. Jackson decided to follow through with vetoing the Second Bank, and part of that veto message is documented in your DBQ essay under Document A. So now let's jump into the second part of the bank war. And this, what you see on the screen here, is reflected in your notes as well. So it says the Bank of the United States was responsible for controlling credit, which means lending money, and lending in the American economy. Banknotes, or paper money, printed by the Second Bank of the U.S. created a reliable, stable money supply. So basically, back then, every bank printed its own money, which was a little bit different than today, where money is printed by the government. So this created confusion because some banks printed money that actually had value, and other banks printed money that was essentially worthless. And when you would pay with paper money, you didn't know if you were paying with, the valuable kind or the worthless kind. So it created a lot of confusion. So it says the Bank of the United States also held the deposits of the federal government, which the bank used to then make loans. So the government put money in the bank, and then the National Bank would use that government money to then loan out to other banks, whatnot. It says the president of the Bank of the United States was a man named Nicholas Biddle. So what we see here is a big factor in this bank war is that Andrew Jackson thinks that he is the elected president of the United States, and he should be making decisions about the U.S. economy. Whereas Nicholas Biddle is the president of the Second Bank of the United States, and he thinks that he is the economic expert and should be doing things through the bank, to benefit the economy. So a lot of this bank war was simply a war of egos between Andrew Jackson, the president of the United States, and Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Second Bank of the United States. So let's keep reading. Biddle took the veto of the recharter of the Bank of the United States personally, like Jackson was coming after him, and Biddle wanted to fight back against Jackson's anti-banking policies. So let's see what happens next. So Jackson's plan was not, now that he's vetoed the bank, now he actually has to kill it and prevent it from existing. So it says Jackson's plan was to remove all federal government deposits, all federal money from the Second Bank of the United States. Let's think about this for a second. Banks make money by giving out loans and charging interest. So if you want to kill a bank, you essentially take all the money out of it so that it has no money to lend out. All right, and that's kind of the mentality here. So let's go down to where it says problem. Doing that, taking all the money out of the Second Bank, would destabilize lending, credit, and the money supply of the United States, because that's all tied to loans. Biddle considered removing the federal deposits as an act of war against the bank. All right, then it says the federal deposits would be removed and from the National Bank, and that money would be spread out. This was Jackson's plan among smaller state banks called pet banks that were loyal to Jackson. So here, think about this like a teacher's pet, sucking up to the teacher. So there were certain small banks that had sucked up to Andrew Jackson and were more acceptable to Democrats. So Jackson said, we're going to take money out of the big corrupt bank and we're going to spread it around to all the smaller like state banks that I like. So that was his plan. And then the next problem was that Jackson had to fire 2 consecutive Treasury secretaries because those 2 Treasury secretaries essentially said, we can't take the money out of the National Bank, the economy will crash. So Jackson said, you're fired. Then the second guy said, I cannot take this money out, the economy is going to crash. Jackson gets rid of him. So it says both men knew the action would devastate the American economy. So then Jackson appoints a third Treasury Secretary, Roger Taney, and Taney agreed to take the U.S. money out of the second bank in 1833. Okay, so when Jackson removes all the money from the second bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle, the president of the second bank, decides to try to get revenge against Jackson. So he required the immediate repayment of all outstanding loans. What I mean by that is that anybody who had taken a loan from the second bank, Biddle said, you need to repay that loan right now. And if you know anything about loans, they're usually paid back over a long period of time. So he basically knew that people were going to be unable to pay back those loans on the spot. Secondly, Nicholas Biddle said, all right, well, if Jackson hates my bank so much, I'm not going to give out any loans to anyone. And that essentially messed with and hurt the economy because our economy cannot run without people taking loans. So the effect, there was a sharp decline in the money supply. There was a decline in business and economic activity overall, and a financial panic was caused because nobody could get a loan, and there was a lack of money in the economy because the second bank of the United States was pretty much in charge of printing money at that time. So it says Whigs in Congress voted to censure. A censure means like a punishment, like a verbal punishment against President Jackson for removing federal deposits from the bank. In your essay, you need to talk about Jackson removing the money and whether this was a good idea or bad idea and what effects it had. So let's talk about now the aftermath. What happened after Jackson removed the U.S. money? So it says aftermath, state banks that received federal deposits, those pet banks, printed too much paper money after receiving those government funds. That led to speculation, gambling in the economy. It led there to be dangerous increases in the price of things, asset bubbles, and it caused inflation because way too much money was floating around and a lot of that money had no value. It says the price of Western land out in the Western U.S., was one of the assets that skyrocketed when all these pet banks started printing money. So what happened next was Andrew Jackson panicked because of all of these economic problems. So in order to prevent some of these problems, and I have more details about these things in your notes, I just didn't want to put everything on the slide, Jackson issues something called the Specie Circular, basically saying from this point forward, if you want to buy land, you can't use paper money, you have to use gold. So this was his way of trying to prevent people from gambling on buying land out west. And then you had something called the Distribution Act. So at the time, we were generating a surplus. The government was taking in more money than it was spending. And the idea was to kind of give this money back. But this plan also led to economic problems. And I would recommend that you read the parts in the notes about the Specie Circular and the Distribution Act. Okay, so we have a few odds and ends here now that we're kind of done with the bank war, because the bank war, even though it's technically over, it's not all the way over, and I'll go through some financial things that kind of are associated with the bank war. This issue on this slide is more about the national debt. When Jackson took over as president, Jackson hated the fact that our country was in debt, so he basically said, I'm not going to spend any new money, and any money that I do raise is going to be used to pay back the national debt. So for the first time for the first and only time in American history, in 1837, Jackson officially paid off all of the national debt. But the problem was that even though he paid it off, that same year, in 1837, the U.S. Had an economic crash. We went into debt, and we've been in debt ever since. Now, where does Jackson's actions fit into here? Jackson's war against the bank was partially the reason why we had an economic panic in 1837. So now let's talk about another thing. In 1835, a mentally ill person named Richard Lawrence attempted to assassinate President Andrew Jackson. This assassin had 2 guns on him, and he tried to use both guns to kill Jackson, but both guns jammed, and neither of them fired. So Jackson basically beat up the guy, pushed him to the ground, and they eventually locked him up. But if either of those guns had been functional, Andrew Jackson would have been the first president ever assassinated. But by the grace of God, both guns jammed, and Jackson survived. Okay, so there's one last topic that we have to talk about here on our PowerPoint slide. And this is, if you look in your notes, right, there's a whole section on Martin Van Buren. He was the president who took over and was elected after Andrew Jackson. Now let's back up a second. Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's vice president during his second term. So when Andrew Jackson served 2 terms and stepped down, Andrew Jackson really wanted his vice president, Martin Van Buren, to take over so that Van Buren could continue the work that Jackson started. But things go terribly for Martin Van Buren, and in defense of Martin Van Buren, none of the things that happened were really his fault. So let's read about what happened. And you can find this section in your notes under Panic of 1837. I am not in this video going to go over the entire Van Buren presidency. I will tell you that for test purposes and for essay purposes, the only part of Martin Van Buren's presidency that you need to know is the Panic of 1837. Feel free to read through the rest, but this is the part that you need to know. So it says, in 1836, the United States was experiencing an economic boom. The economy was actually too good because there was inflation and a lot of gambling and a lot of land speculation and things like that. It says canal and railroad builders were at peak activity, prices were rising, money was plentiful, credit was easy. Banks were loaning out more money than they should have because banks were printing too much money and lending too much money. The land business was booming. Between 1835 and 1837, the federal government sold 40 million acres of land to people so that they could build houses and live there. 3/4 of these buyers were speculators, gamblers who hoped that buying this land cheap would lead to increased profits in the future. So then the problem, in 1837, state banks began running out of gold and silver. And then in 1839, there was a second wave where basically the economy crashed. And between 1837 and 1839, people lost their jobs. There was decrease in prices. Businesses went bankrupt. The price of land nosedived. So basically, there was a 5-year economic depression after 1837. So now for your purposes, you have to kind of evaluate, part of this panic was caused by Andrew Jackson's war on the second bank of the United States. Because when he took the money out of the national bank, he distributed that money to other little tiny banks that lent out too much money. And when they lent out too much money, that led to this economic crash. So I would say that's something that you have to evaluate in your essay regarding the bank war. Were Jackson's actions justified? I don't want to make it seem like Jackson was the sole cause of the Panic of 1837, but his bank war was certainly an aspect of it. So let's finish off the Panic of 1837 here. It says, Van Buren blamed the economic collapse on businesses, banks, and easy credit, which meant too much lending. Whig leaders blamed the Democratic economic policies, especially Jackson's policies that everything had to be purchased in gold. That was the Specie Circular. And the Whigs pointed out that the destruction of the Bank of the United States was a leading cause. State banks were accused of overprinting money without proper regulation. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst economic depressions in U.S. history and was one of the worst until the Great Depression in the 1930s. So everybody, this is where we come to an end. Okay, that is everything you need to know about the rest of the bank war. Please highlight anything that you feel is important or necessary. If anything that I said verbally resonated with you and you want to add it to your notes, you certainly can. I'm going to do a quick YouTube search to see if there's a quick video on Martin Van Buren's presidency that you can watch. If I find anything, I will attach it to the Google Classroom. But basically at this point, you are all good to start working on your DBQ organizer, which I am going to count as a grade eventually. We'll talk more about the due date of your DBQ organizer when I see you again in class. Thank you so much. All right, I'll see you. Have a great day.